Min-maxing, which could also be called hyper-optimization, is not exclusive to playing games. It's how businesses operate, how fitness regimes are created. There are thousands of videos alone on how to optimize your success on Twitch and YouTube. Maybe I should watch some of them. Fear of missing out can have a seriously powerful psychological effect on us, which is a good thing, because if you don't watch this video, you risk missing out on the incredible, I can't do it. We are being constantly conditioned by subtle and some not so subtle psychological effects, and these effects pose interesting questions for games, their players and developers. This video is about that. The term min-maxing first appeared in the AD&D Dungeons Master's Guide in 1995 on page 45, where it referred to choosing the optimal weapon proficiencies for specific combat encounters. Pen and paper D&D has a lot in common with video games, obviously, but it also has a lot in common with running a business, staying in good physical shape, or even looking after your pet fish. You see, all of these systems are housed inside a set of rules. These rules can be simple. For instance, if you have a pet fish and you don't feed it, sooner or later your fish is going to die. If an architect is designing a skyscraper, they have to ensure it can withstand high wind speeds, otherwise it might collapse during a future storm. If a pharmaceutical company is developing a new medicine for a new illness, they have to ensure it doesn't cause inflammation of the heart instead of treating the illness, otherwise they are looking at some costly lawsuits, assuming that is, they didn't manage to backhandedly wiggle out of any legal ramifications brought about by their negligence. Life has rules. Some are clear-cut: drink water or die, don't fall for longer than a few seconds without a parachute or die. Others are more bendy: don't want to shower, you'll start to smell and people won't like you. Maybe you'll get a rash. You don't have to shower, but there are consequences for not abiding to at least a minimal degree of personal hygiene. You can tattoo a swastika on your face. You can stand outside of a school and take pictures of children you don't know, but society has rules and it will let you know when you start to bend them too far. If bending rules one way leads to a life of ruin and a quick trip to prison, bending them the other way can lead to fulfillment, joy, money, purpose. Pick your poison. Some you have no control over: your parents, your teachers, your interests and fascinations, your face, at least to an extent. Others you do, where you invest your time and how you treat other people. Assuming free will exists, which is a whole other video, there are choices we make that can improve life and others that will make us miserable. If free will doesn't exist, then this video is pointless and you might as well stop watching now, or not. I guess you don't really have a choice either way. Which brings me to cheating. It's harder, although not impossible, to cheat the rules of the human experience. Yes, you have to drink water to survive, but there's nothing stopping you from mixing that water with sugar and caffeine. Sure, long term it's not going to lead anywhere good, but instant gratification is a tempting mistress. Some rules can't be cheated. You can't remove your brain and blend it. Blending brains is not something, at least currently, the rules allow. If you're wanting to remain alive, that is. Rules exist. They have limitations. Some are bendier than others, some are blendier than others, and they are a fundamental part of the conscious experience. Video games have rules. Modding aside, I can't bungee jump in Skyrim or open an Indian restaurant in Halo. And so, just as in real life, we as players have limitations on what we can do inside a game. But within those limitations, there exist certain axioms of freedom, and there are consequences in how you choose to navigate that freedom. The Elder Scrolls Morrowind, Bethesda's arguably best single-player RPG, has a skill system that allows any skill in the game to be leveled to 100, regardless of what starting stats you create your character with. It might seem intuitive at first glance that every character at max level would as a result be identical in terms of power. After all, every character would have all their skills at level 100. But Morrowind has rules, and one such rule dictates how many points you can allocate into each of your attributes every time you level up. In Morrowind, skills are split into 3 categories: major skills, minor skills, and the remaining miscellaneous skills. Major skills start at level 30, minors at 15, and miscellaneous skills at 5. Not to complicate matters, each skill is assigned to a governing attribute. For example, Longblade is governed by strength. There are 8 primary attributes: strength, intelligence, willpower, agility, speed, endurance, personality, and luck. There are also different races, and each of these races has bonuses to certain skills. For example, the Dumner, also known as Dark Elves, have a racial bonus to 5 in the Longblade, meaning if you created a Dumner and chose the Longblade as a major skill, you would start the game with 35 points invested in the skill. 30 is the default for it being a major skill, and the +5 racial bonus for starting as a Dumner. You level in Morrowind by ranking up 10 times in any combination of your major and minor skills. Increasing miscellaneous skills will not count towards your character level progression. Even here we can start to see a problem emerging. If you started the game as a Dumner and picked Longblade as a major skill, you would start the game with a Longblade skill of 35, and thus could only increase its rank 65 times to reach the cap of 100. If however you started as a Bosmer who don't have a racial bonus to Longblade, the skill would start at 30, allowing you to rank up 70 times, which gives you an extra half a level of progression that you would have otherwise missed out on. There are some races like Orcs who have a +10 racial bonus. One of these is the Block skill, meaning if you created an Orc and chose Block as a major skill, you would be essentially denying yourself an entire level worth of progression. And with Orcs having a total of 4 skills that start with a +10 modifier, that's potentially 4 levels worth of attribute increases that you're missing out on. If you take this system and apply it across the 10 combined major and minor skills, you can miss out on a lot of XP. And that's only the start. The governing attributes for each skill, that's strength, intellect, agility, etc., will also grant you additional attribute points to allocate depending on which skill were advanced in order to level up. Let's take our Dumner with the major skill of Longblade. As mentioned, Longblade is governed by strength. Let's say you only wanted to rank up Longblade in order to level. In such a case, you would have to level the skill 10 times. Because all the skills we use to level, in this case Longblade, had the same governing attribute, in this case strength, Morrowind rewards us with bonus attribute points to assign into raising our strength. And it's not a small bonus. Leveling skills assigned to the same attribute 10 times during a level will allow you to add 5 points to that specific attribute on level up. Not raising any skill of that attribute will only allow you to increase the attribute by 1 point. And whilst leveling miscellaneous skills doesn't go towards increasing your character level, it does interact with the bonus attribute points given on level up. If our Dumner had athletics as a miscellaneous skill and we raised our athletics by 10 alongside the 10 points to Longblade, not only would we get +5 bonus to strength from the Longblade skill, we would also get a +5 bonus to speed from athletics, because athletics is governed by the speed attribute. I just remembered I said not to complicate things. Put simply, in terms of optimizing the power of a character in Morrowind, you ideally want to start the game with a character that has no bonuses to any major or minor skills and the lowest possible bonuses to miscellaneous skills. In other words, you want to create the weakest possible version of the character you want to play as, so as to allow you the largest possible growth in power, which is counterintuitive in a lot of ways, but that's just the way the game systems work in Morrowind. If you want the strongest character, you have to start as the weakest and work your way up. There is an additional system in play when it comes to health. Your health in Morrowind is based off of your endurance attribute, and it does not retroactively scale, meaning that in order to maximize your health gains, you want to start the game with the highest possible endurance rating and then prioritize raising skills governed by endurance so that you gain the +5 bonus to endurance every level, otherwise you're losing out on health you can never get back. There are also specializations and birth signs to further complicate this process, and the whole thing becomes fairly tedious, and that's all before you start actually playing the game. It's exhausting and it's not fun. It's not fun and it's not required. Morrowind becomes a cakewalk by the time you hit somewhere around level 40, even on the hardest difficulty scaling, which renders the need to min-max completely pointless. And Morrowind is an RPG, a role-playing game. The whole idea of the game is to create your character with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. But many people don't see that anymore. After all, if you wanted to create the strongest possible longsword-wielding Dumner, you would be actively weakening yourself by following common sense and investing in the Longblade from the start. So part of the blame here falls on Morrowind's systems designers for creating systems that actively punish role-playing, and part of the blame falls on us as players who optimise the fun out of the experience by railroading ourselves in the pursuit of a perfect character. But the fact that you don't need anywhere near an optimised build to play and complete Morrowind on the hardest difficulty doesn't stop the content machine from spewing out guide after guide on the best Morrowind builds, even today, over 20 years after the game's release, and that makes me feel very old. People are still producing tier lists, rankings, and OP build guides. There exists for almost every game ever made, hundreds of online checklists and guides where players can follow along a almost literal Excel sheet of steps that will optimize their progression from start to finish. There is a deceptively large proportion of gamers who prefer to remove all of their own agency and let someone else take the reins of control instead of actually playing the game for themselves. Video games used to be something we played, not something we did. At least that's what they started out as, because as min-maxing has become more prevalent, the game systems designed to facilitate and encourage this approach to gaming have also become more common. But not all games are created equal, and this focus on hyper-optimization has a different impact on each genre it inflicts. Morrowind is a single-player game, one that encourages player freedom, perhaps more so than say a typical FPS or action-adventure game, and yet despite this, it doesn't stop people from trying to eke out every possible ounce of power from a character build where they can. It's the same for every game in the Elder Scrolls series, for every RPG with character progression, for every game with any degree of choice and consequence. It all comes down to choice. If given a choice, people generally want to make the best choice, but what defines best can often be subjective. The best choice for you might be the one you find the most fun, a combat style that you enjoy playing, role-playing a specific character, or maybe you just want to make your character as strong as possible at the expense of everything else. It's your choice, and that's fine. What you do in your playthrough has no impact on what I do in mine, and so we can coexist peacefully. Sekiro, in my opinion, is one of FromSoft's best games, but also one of their hardest. Primarily due to the lack of choice, there are no character levels, no way to pump your vitality and increase your health, no heavy armor, no real ranged weapon, no real magic, and at the end of Sekiro, most players will have access to an identical toolkit, with the main choice coming down to what prosthetic tools you prefer to use. There are some instances where the prosthetic tool you use will be dictated by the game. Enemies carrying shields are best tackled with the axe tool, enemies afraid of fire are made easier with the flame vent, but almost all enemies can be defeated with no tools. The game's final boss, Ishin, is one of the game's harder fights. Not only is it a 3-phase fight, with each new phase introducing new abilities and subtle changes to animation wind-ups and environmental effects like lightning, but before even fighting Ishin, the player must defeat Genichiro again, a previous boss, albeit with only a single phase and this time a vastly simplified moveset. But in essence, Ishin is a 4-phase fight, and if the player has been diligent in collecting the prayer beads around the game, which isn't hard to do, I think there are 40 in total, most of them will be found naturally as you progress through the game, then there's no real way outside of that to tilt the scales any further in your favour outside of playing better. All the player has the choice of is their use of prosthetic tool and the skill they possess. Of course, some tools are better against Ishin than others, firecrackers remain as useful as ever, and the umbrella can deflect some of his attacks. But when I finally defeated him after over an hour of attempts, I hadn't used any of them. Not through choice, I was simply so focused on Sekiro's main combat mechanics and getting them right that I didn't have the time to think about anything beyond that. It's a testament to Sekiro's combat system that it remains relatively inflexible and yet is the most engaging version of FromSoft's signature style to date. But what has Sekiro got to do with min-maxing? Well, nothing, and that's my point. In my video, The Limitations of Success, I spoke about how limitations can lead to a better experience, and Sekiro highlights this point perfectly. FromSoft have never managed to make combat feel as tight as they did in Sekiro, and it's because in the Souls series, there are simply too many choices the player can make. Thus, the combat system needs to be flexible enough to accommodate those choices. But flexible systems are just that. Flexible. They need to bend and shift. and so are by definition not as tight as a system that streamlines everything down to a few hyper-polished mechanics. I say this only to highlight the point that more choice is not a prerequisite for a good game. Morrowind can be enjoyed without min-maxing, Sekiro doesn't have the flexibility to allow for much of any min-maxing, and both are excellent single-player games. But what happens when we step outside the bubble of single-player games and into the world of online games? Suddenly there is an expectation placed upon each of us that we be optimal in our approach. And it's a fair expectation, it's the same expectation we contend with in school and in our careers. It can be summed up as such: here is a set of rules and here is the end goal that needs to be accomplished. Find the optimal path through said rules which maximises the degree to which the end goal is met. What optimal means is debatable. In business, optimal generally means what generates the most amount of money. It's more complicated than that, of course. If you're selling a product, scamming your customers might make a lot of money initially, but sooner or later word will get around, and so your long-term profits will suffer. But I don't want to wander too far off course. If being optimal in business is making the most amount of money, then that optimization has to take into consideration both short and long-term consequences. And optimization is everywhere. Want to optimize your health? Mix this green powder into water and drink it every day. Move your body in these specific ways. Have this number of friends. Don't hide from the sun for too long, but don't get too friendly with it either. Don't put that in your mouth. Definitely don't put that in your butt. Freeze your body for a few minutes every day and then heat it back up for another few minutes. Bend a lot, but not from your back. But also bend from your back, but just not whilst carrying a lot of weight. Smile lots, but not at children you don't know. Only eat once a day and make sure you don't stress about any of that, because stress is the worst thing you can do for your health. But remember that terrible things will happen if you don't do everything mentioned optimally. Do you want to optimize your career? Work hard. Don't complain even if the situations you observe question your morals. You're not sick if you can get out of bed, but don't come into work if you are sick. But if you don't come in, are you really giving it your all? Don't worry that the majority of your time is spent doing something that actively makes you unhappy, and that it contributes towards the downfall of not only your species but also the planet you live on. Ensure that you are driven by material possessions. God help you if you aren't. Find the most important person in your organisation and lie to them as much as you need to in order to make them like you. Sacrifice your personal passions and values during the most quality years of your life, and hey, if you're lucky, you might be able to afford a house by the time you're 40. When I say afford a house, I mean the down payment on a mortgage you'll be saddled with for the rest of your life. Also, remember, don't stress about any of this. Stress is the worst thing you can do for your health. It can all get pretty oppressive. Sometimes I just want to live, as in, put one foot in front of the other and see where life goes. But over and over again we're told that this is the wrong way to go about living. You should know every step in detail, have an optimised path for success planned out years in advance, and simply follow the pre-planned route. The GPS will get you there faster. Sure, you might miss out on the views, the adventure, but you'll get there faster, right? It's just, the destination is death, so maybe it's no bad thing to slow down and smell the roses. Getting back to games, there are a number of techniques used by developers to counter the insatiable urge that players have to hyper-optimize. Either they make the game systems as complicated as possible, which only slows down the inevitable at the arguably more damaging expense of overcomplicating and obfuscating said systems, or as is more popular, by shaking up the meta. This includes frequent and large changes to game mechanics, classes, number tuning and systems, which seems to only serve as a means of generating more content for streamers and YouTubers. Sticking with the Elder Scrolls for simplicity's sake, the Elder Scrolls Online suffers a lot from this very problem. A common complaint from ESO players is the constant shaking up of the meta, requiring players to spend a lot of their time building new gear sets to remain competitive after each new balancing patch comes down the pipeline. A more conspiratorial-minded person might see this as the game's developer ZeniMax's way of artificially extending content. After all, if players have to rebuild an entire endgame gear set every few months, that's going to keep them busy. And of course, they are going to do it because who wants to be viewed as non-optimal? especially by their peers. It seems a perfectly valid development decision to capitalize on the psychology of your player base and the fear of missing out in order to keep players logging into your game, logging in and spending money, that is. And I'm not calling out ZeniMax here. This sort of consumer manipulation is everywhere. Pre-order bonuses, the thing where you give a company money for a product before the product exists, and in return they give you a little bonus, like a sparkly pony or a shiny hat. A little reward for being a good consumer. And why not give them the money first? Companies are trustworthy. They have your best interests at heart, and if you don't pre-order, you might not be able to get that shiny hat ever again. A hat that other people will have, because they pre-ordered the game. You're not poor, are you? But that all pales in comparison, and frankly is a pretty outdated view of the gaming industry currently. So strong are our own internal desires to be optimal that it became pretty clear to game publishers that they didn't have to masquerade psychological, predatory marketing behind the guise of glittery treats. They could just tell you outright, hey, you gamer, give us more money and we will make you more optimal. We will make you more powerful. And so give them more money. The gamers did. Battle passes, premium battle passes, seasonal battle passes, XP boosts, the list goes on. Some people didn't like their kids getting addicted to gambling, so out with the loot boxes and in with the reward pack, because so long as we're only preying on your social conditioning and we're not gambling, then it's a totally morally justifiable way to conduct business. Timmy might only be 10 years old, but do you really want your little Timmy to be the only one of his friends without the new Bobby K yacht mount? He would be looked down upon by his peers and probably hate you for not buying it for him. You don't want your kid to hate you, do you? It's only a $20 mount and you can't put a price on love. But even outside of the frankly immoral business practices of modern gaming, gamers themselves don't do each other any favours. Gaming culture has become a cesspool of tier lists, meta-analysis and min-maxing to the degree that I don't really enjoy engaging in my favourite genre of game anymore. I've been playing MMOs since I was a kid. I started with Ultima and EverQuest 1, RuneScape and WoW. I had played a lot of MMOs, too many. I wasted my life, learned from my mistakes. I stopped playing WoW as a main game partway through Cataclysm, but every new expansion I will come back, give Blizzard, Activision Blizzard, Bobby to be honest, give Bobby his $40 and check out what the game has to offer. With the release of Dragonflight this was no different, although I think this is the least amount of time I've stayed active in the game after an expansion drop. But I did no-life Dragonflight for the first 3 weeks, and by the end of the first week of Season 1 I had cleared the first raid, Fault of the Incarnate, on normal, and I think we were 6 out of 8 on heroic. I was pushing into 18 keys in Mythic Plus, I did all the side quests, maxed my Rathian rep, maxed both my professions, and I had a good time doing it. The following week I cancelled my subscription. The content was alright, I mean it's just more World of Warcraft. There's only so far copy-pasting the Guild Wars 2 Griffin mount can take you, but it wasn't the content that killed my desire to keep playing, it was the community. I couldn't care less if you call me names in an online video game. I like the banter, it's all good fun in my book. What I can't deal with is the constant back and forth on meta builds injected into every aspect of the game. I just want to run a Mythic Plus. I don't want to listen to two people argue about talent choices for 25 minutes to an hour even before we start the run. Just play the game. It's a plus 15. It's easy. To be fair to Blizzard, they did try to offer more choice with the reworked talent systems, but at the end of the day, if you give someone a choice, there's almost always going to be a best choice depending on the situation. And if the priest in your raid group isn't running with the optimal build, then they are by definition reducing the overall efficiency of the entire group. If you spread that across 20 players, all operating at only 80% efficiency, you end up with a lot of potential that is being wasted. It doesn't matter if you can clear the content suboptimally, you should be optimal. That is priority number 1. It blew my mind on the release of WoW Classic that almost every raiding guild was requiring 40-man Molten Core and Blackwing lair groups to not only spend upwards of an hour before every raid getting every world buff, but that flasks too were compulsory, which was good for me as an alchemist, but it also led to a lot of frustration for many players. Flasks were expensive. On my server they sold for over 100 gold, and if you were raiding 3 nights a week, with 2 flasks per raid, that was upwards of 600 gold a week in flasks alone, never mind other consumables. It was simply an unachievable amount of gold in the pursuit of optimization, but it didn't stop the tryhards from mandating it, and as much as it's easy to say, just find a better guild bruh, once the precedent has been set, it trickles down into the wider community. You only have to look at the hundreds of posts that emerged on this topic to see just how pressured people felt to be optimal, and the distress that it caused them when that bar was unable to be cleared. And bear in mind, this is for content that can be cleared very easily in mediocre gear, below level 60 with far less than 40 players, but it didn't matter. What mattered was being optimal, and you either were or you weren't. And I get it. I understand why players want their group to be optimal, just in the same way I understand why businesses want to operate optimally. That there is an optimal way to work out, to stay healthy, to eat or sleep or socialise or manage your finances. I get it, I really do. I just don't want to do it all the time. I don't think life should be this tightly constrained path that we stick to in the pursuit of being optimal. It should be messy and spontaneous in all the ways only life can be. After all, if every step you take is a pre-planned one, then where is the self-expression? What are you outside of another carbon copy retreading the most optimal and well-travelled path to the grave? And in the same vein, I don't enjoy it in my games. It's why I prefer games where player choice is limited correctly, which might be viewed as a rather antiquated view to hold today. There is a balance to be struck between self-expression in a game and the rule set that constrains the player's choices, a sweet spot between Sekiro and Elden Ring. The more a game strays towards player freedom, the bendier those rules have to become, the more the experience has to be loose and flexible enough to accommodate all those potential choices. On the other hand, much like in life, if the rules are too set in stone, they can feel cruel and unjust. We all must die, but there are many different ways we can die. We all must live, for however long we are granted life, but there are many different ways we can live. So in the end, I guess it comes down to personal choice. As much as I hate it, the meta approach to gaming is here to stay. There are simply too many people who cannot shut off that psychological switch, and I don't blame them. Everywhere you look, you're bombarded with the best way to play games, the best weapons to use, the best builds, the best way to play your class in an MMO. And in the case of MMOs, even if you decide not to look at any content outside of the game and play the game your way, your fellow MMO players will make sure that you know that you aren't playing optimal, and they will bully you into playing optimally. And you either get on board the meta train, or you go and find other players to play with and watch with them as that meta train blazes ahead of you into the distance and out of sight.